Thank you very much, Dallas. Now, Dallas is very happy to take some questions now from the audience.
You just, all this lecture is what is increasing cancer, what is reducing cancer. What is actually causing cancer?
Well, tobacco is the number one cause. Tobacco increases cancer.
Yeah, but how the cancer is started? What is the mechanism there?
Well, it's complex because tobacco contains about 200 different substances, many of which are carcinogenic. So often cancers are caused by mutations. So a lot of the carcinogenic substances in cancer actually mutate DNA in cells in the lung and other tissues. So it's probably not the right place to go into the kind of mechanisms in great detail, but tobacco is definitely something that increases the risk of cancer dramatically. And it is in New Zealand, as anywhere else in the Western world, the number one avoidable cause of cancer. So obesity, I think probably between 5 and 10% of all cancers are probably due to that. And it depends on the prevalence of obesity in a population. And that will increase over time. Physical inactivity, you saw the estimates there are relatively low, but they are important causes in their own right. So if the whole population became more physically active, we would reduce the risk of heart disease, we would reduce the risk of diabetes and the risk of cancer, and people would feel better as well. So, I think those are the kinds of lifestyle things that I think are the most important.
As somebody who's off the scale for women and just about every measurement, I would like to say that for me, waist measurements are no use at all. And I think that there's an enormous range of size in people, and we really need to have at least one other parameter to compare it to and for the variation we're talking about.
None of these is perfect. Look, I agree. Waist circumference is more predictive than body mass index, and it doesn't. Waist circumference doesn't suffer from the same problems as weight. In terms of weight, the taller you are, the heavier, the more you weigh. Whereas for waist circumference, the correlation between height and waist circumference isn't very high. And that's one of the reasons why I like it. I also like it because it's a very simple thing to consider, waist circumference. And I readily admit it's not a perfect measure. But it's pretty good, at the population level, it's pretty good, and it's better than BMI.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned earlier on about the incidence of prostate cancer tripling between the mid-80s and the mid-2000s, and you followed up by saying that that was one of the major downsides of the PSA test. I wonder, could you elaborate on that, please?
Aren't you talking about this on Saturday morning?
The complex thing about prostate cancer is there is a lot of prostate cancer which if you didn't look for it, you would never know you had it. So it would never cause you problems, it would never be diagnosed. And as soon as you start screening, you start finding that cancer. And that wouldn't be a problem in itself if the treatment was easy and didn't cause you any problems. But the trouble is, once you're diagnosed with prostate cancer, you tend to get treated for prostate cancer. And so you end up with the side effects from the treatment, which is often things like incontinence and impotence and things like that. That's okay if the treatment is saving your life, but if you're actually being diagnosed with something that you would never have known you even had if you hadn't looked for it, that's a problem. So the problem with prostate cancer screening is you overdiagnose all these men who never would have known they had prostate cancer. So that's one of the issues with prostate cancer.
Still comes down to the individual's choice, though, what decision
That's right. That's right. And so that's one of the things an individual has to weigh up. Like, how risk averse are they? How concerned are they about the potential for being overdiagnosed? But it's quite a complicated decision. It's not nearly as simple as people might think that it is.
And the most recent evidence from the European randomised trial is that for every one man whose life is saved, there's 37 men who are treated without benefit. That's pretty low, benefit to harm ratio, if you ask me.
Please define facts.
Sorry?
You mentioned fat several times.
Oh, fat.
Undefined.
Oh, sorry. Yes, my mistake. We're talking about fat in food. So monounsaturates, polyunsaturates, and saturated fats. All those analyses that people have typically done have tended to break those down, but they've also looked at all fat. You can also look at fat from animal sources versus fat from plant sources. But in totality, the evidence that fats increase the risk of cancer is quite low now. Yeah, so from all of those sources.
So most of the risk factors that you talked about are things you stuff down your neck or you get from the sun. So you never mention anything about like stress.
No, I didn't. No, I've not seen. Yeah, I've not seen any credible evidence that stress increases the risk of cancer. I know it's a common thought, and in fact, when we do focus groups about what causes cancer, that's the first thing that people say. But the epidemiological studies that have looked at it have not found anything credible in terms of stress increasing the risk. By the way, my talk was around lifestyle factors, but there are other things as well, like, for example, exposure to asbestos, which is a very strong risk factor for cancer. But I didn't talk about things that, in a sense that we can control less ourselves.
There's a lady here and a gentleman in front of you. So,
Thanks. If you add up all the percentages that you've estimated, obviously it doesn't come to 100%. There's a huge gap there. And I was just wondering whether you think there's like one large factor that hasn't been discovered, or whether it's much more likely to be a sprinkling of many other things.
I think it's more likely to be a sprinkling of many things than it is one large factor. I mean, we have found one large factor in the last few years, that's obesity. But the chances of us finding things like that, to which a lot of people in the population are exposed, I think are diminishing with time. I think it's fair to say that a lot of the low-hanging fruit's being picked, and that will become increasingly difficult. There are some people that say that epidemiology has reached its limits in its ability to find these kinds of things, because for example, another area in which our work is looking at genetic associations. And we are finding relative risks for particular genetic variants that are in the order of 1.08, for example. So in other words, an 8% increase in the risk. To do that requires an enormous number of people, like 40 or 50,000 people sometimes. And so there are, like for breast cancer, there's about somewhere between 8 and a dozen of these genetic variants that all increase the risk by very small amounts. So it's likely that it's going to be a combination of studies like that, looking at very small risk factors or very weak risk factors, together with some of the other things that will show. But for example, people have constructed models for prediction of risk for breast cancer, and we could prevent a substantial proportion of breast cancer based on what we already know. It's just a question of whether it's societally acceptable to take action in some of those areas, for example. And the same is true for colon cancer. More than half of colon cancer could be prevented with what we know, without even having to find new risk factors. But we have to find new risk factors, otherwise I'll be out of a job.
Approximately 30 years ago, I went to a lecture by Professor McCadden from the Canadian College in East Africa. And he produced a slide which showed what he described as the perfect stool, which was a large pile in the middle of the room.
Yes.
Now, he talked endlessly about fibre. What has happened to fibre as an entity?
Well, it's large. I mean, the hypothesis sort of died completely around a decade ago, and it's been slightly resurrected because of better measurements of diet. But nobody now believes that the reason we have so much cancer in the Western world compared with some other places, and that's only true for some cancers, by the way, is because of fibre. So fibre appears to be a weak risk factor for colorectal cancer, or lack of fibre. And so I know I've seen those pictures myself. In fact, they're quite interesting. But But it doesn't seem to explain the effect. So physical activity and obesity appear to be much better predictors of colon cancer than is fibre intake, for example.
Is there any prospect of using animals or laboratory situations to test for the malignant potential of food in the diet? It's always struck me how arbitrary the results of diet testing are. Because
Yeah, I mean, it's done a lot. I mean, with food additives, for example, there's a lot of animal testing. And there's also a lot of testing when, say, the epidemiologists do some studies and show, for example, that particular fatty acids, I didn't talk about particular fatty acids, but if you talk about, there's what's called long-chain unsaturated fatty acids that are found, for example, in fish. So there have been animal studies of those in particular that show that they do reduce tumour burden in animals, but the evidence in humans is much weaker, for example. So there are a lot of animal studies. There's a lot of also basic science, cell biology and so forth, looking at these kinds of things. But ultimately, to test out whether something is going to be beneficial or harmful in humans, you do need to do the human studies.
Has the research on the red meat looked back at the sources of the red meat and distinguished between animals that might be free range versus, farmed?
Short answer to that is no.
Versus etc. etc. Okay.
No, the short answer is no, because most of the evidence comes, as I said before, from food frequency questionnaires where we ask about how often you eat steak, how often you eat lamb chops, etc., etc. We don't have any idea of where that came from that people ate. To do those kinds of studies in the kind of populations that I deal with would be prohibitively expensive. All you can do is actually look at the components or the composition of meat that's come from different sources and kind of impute the potential effects, but you can't do it in the kinds of studies that I do.
I'm just referring to your last PowerPoint. Just in reference to that is how obesity is the major factor. Can you put that up again? That one?
It's not the major factor, but it is.
No, just in reference to nutrition and the obesity. It's interesting that the dietary factors is important, which I recognise that. But interesting enough, the biggest source of energy that people eat in the diet from fat and fructose, increasingly so, not so much in New Zealand, but in the United States. And so I feel that more emphasis will have to be placed on what actually people consume in order to make them obese. People aren't terribly aware of that, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, the actual evidence around what, the kind of diet that you eat in obesity is not all that strong. I'm surprised. It's not an area in which I work because I tend, but when I've looked at that, there's not a great deal of evidence that eating a lot of this is more likely to make you obese than eating a lot of that. For example, if you take alcohol, alcohol's got a lot of energy in it. But people who drink a lot of alcohol tend not to be any more obese than people that don't drink alcohol. So obviously people are compensating in some way, and there's very complex feedback systems as well. But presumably, the people who are consuming alcohol are reducing their intake from other sources. It's not an area that I'm an expert in by any means, and I recognise it's incredibly complex.
It is complex because actually alcohol provides an enormous amount of calories. Actually.
Yeah, that's what I said, yeah.
So
But, as I said, I've not yet seen very many studies where the people who consume more alcohol than other people, than the ones actually are more likely to be obese. In our own study, for example, the people who consume the most alcohol have the lowest body mass index. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question about selenium? I came to one of these lectures, and I'm a bit vague on the details, a number of years ago, and I believe the speaker was talking about bowel cancer and talked about the New Zealand soil being deficient in selenium to the point and suggested Brazil nuts as a way of supplementing. And so we've changed our lifestyle to include Brazil nuts to increase the selenium. Now, what you've suggested tonight didn't support that?
Well, the two trials that were set up to test the hypothesis that selenium decreased the risk of prostate cancer both showed the opposite.
With
Prostate cancer.
I think it might have been bowel cancer that this was discussed.
Yeah, well, prostate cancer is the one for which the evidence was the strongest in the first place. The evidence for bowel cancer was never as strong as it was for prostate cancer, and then these trials showed not what we expected.
The original recommended daily allowance for if you are to have, I work in the field of nutrition, it's actually only 4 Brazil nuts per day for an adult. So it's not a
Yeah.
You talked about stress, but how about personality factors studies? Is that
Well,
discredited?
Yeah, that's mostly been studied in relation to breast cancer. And we actually put it into, well, I didn't. We had Ron Borland, who works in the Cancer Council Victoria, inserted an instrument to measure various aspects of personality back at the baseline of our study. And when we looked at it, we couldn't find any association at all. And in fact, when we reviewed the evidence, again, it's very weak and very inconsistent, to the point where I would say, if you use what IARC says, they talk about inadequate evidence. At the moment, I'd say the evidence is inadequate to suggest that that personality is associated in any way with cancer. It may be that there's not enough high-quality studies, but studies like ours weren't bad, and we used the best instruments that were available at the time. It's not perfect by any means.
I'd just like to clarify that when Dallas was talking about inserting an instrument at baseline, that means asking some questions, not, finding out what people's personality was like by... Still like to clarify.
Yes, hadn't thought about it like that. Someone who studies bowel cancer.
Comment on the relationship with some diseases and cancer, such as colitis and colon cancers.
Yeah, colitis, Crohn's, they increase the risk of bowel cancer. I didn't talk about those. Yeah, those strongly increase the risk. Fortunately, they're relatively uncommon, but they certainly do increase the risk. Yep.
I know you said that there's no strong evidence from any particular dietary factors, but have you guys looked much into sugar?
Yeah, that's been looked at a lot, and no, there's no credible evidence that sugar. I mean, one of those pooled analyses. We belong to several international consortia, which gives me the occasional international trip. It's very nice, but. One of those ones we've been looking at pancreatic cancer, which is where you might find it the most. We've been looking at things like carbonated, soft drinks and those kinds of things. And there's a hint of something there, but it's not very strong. And that's with a very large sample of about 28 cohort studies from all over the world.
If there's a history of, or a family history of cancer, does that mean that the risk factors are more, have a bigger impact?
That's a very good question. And one which I'm not sure I'm that well equipped to answer. For women that have a BRCA1 mutation, which I don't know whether everyone knows what that is, but it's a particular gene which, when a woman has a faulty copy of it, increases her risk of breast cancer dramatically. There's some evidence from what's called the breast family registry, of which people that I work with belong to, that suggests that the risk factors for those women are not the same as they are for women of average risk. But that's a very specific population. BRCA1 mutations are relatively uncommon. So for women with an increased risk because of a family history of breast cancer, but who doesn't have a BRCA1 mutation, the current evidence suggests, for example, that the risk factors would be much the same as in women without a family history.
And what about prostate and bowel cancer?
As far as I'm aware, that's true. I mean, most studies tend to look at that, and often some of them find differences, some of them don't, but on balance, I think most of them find that the risk factors are pretty much the same. However, the way we look at these things, it means that, like for example, if you're obese and you have a family history, so let's suppose that being obese might double the risk of bowel cancer and having a family history might triple it. Putting those two together means you've got a 6-fold increased risk. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, I was just wondering, some people don't think cancer as a name should be used for much longer. Obviously all the diseases looking at here, they're all very different. They've got different outcomes and different causative factors. Do you think the word cancer will eventually become meaningless because we're looking at such different groups of diseases that just happen to be grouped under one name?
It's a good question, one which I think you need. Well, I'm not sure I can answer the question, but you're very right. They are different, and even if you look at breast cancer, there's now at least 5 different kinds of breast cancer that have been defined by their molecular profiles. The same for bowel cancer, and they all tend to have different risk factors for the different kinds. So, for example, for bowel cancer, we found that only one kind is related to alcohol consumption and the other 2 are not, the other 2 main ones. So maybe you're right, but I don't know. I don't think it will happen in my working life. Yeah, there's... Yeah, now you're going back a long time. There were studies of saccharin, which was used as an artificial sweetener, I think in the 1970s, I think the studies date from. And there was 1 or 2 in particular that suggested there was an increased risk of bladder cancer from memory, if my memory serves me right, but not replicated. And none of the other artificial sweeteners that I'm aware of have been shown to increase the risk of any cancers. Again, as I said, that initial finding wasn't replicated. Yeah.
Yes, I was a little bit shocked to hear you talk about people filling out questionnaires reporting what they ate the day before. Surely they just have an app on their cell phone. Pick the stuff off on a list. What they ate most often would always be at the top of the list. And it will go automatically to your database.
Yeah, look, technology is changing the way we measure diet. I talked about the ones that, when we last did 24-hour recalls, it was 5 years ago, and we phoned people up and went through it. But there are now online versions of that do the same kind of thing, and there's no doubt apps for smartphones that could do the same thing. You just have to make sure people actually do it. But yes, I mean, those kinds of things are definitely the way of the future. So there are already ways of measuring diet and physical activity like that, and they're going to be far better than the kind of incredibly crude methods that we used when we began our study.
Going back to the past week again, the person behind me who advocated a change of name makes me think that when I was a house surgeon registrar, we would push that name to get people to use the word cancer. Then the patient knew what sort of disease they had. Now we are hearing that process may be undergoing another change.
I think what she was saying was that there's not one beast called cancer. They're all different. They're very heterogeneous. They have different risk factors. They occur obviously in different sites. So therefore, to use the single term cancer is probably a bit misleading, rather than being concerned about the use of the word. Is that correct? Yeah. So it wasn't. Yeah, she wasn't worried about using the word. It was rather than it's becoming misleading, given what we now know about cancer and how heterogeneous it is.
Have you guys ever thought about studying why people don't get cancer? But, you know, it's interesting because, you know, all the studies are about what causes cancer. You could, if you turned it up the other way and you sort of said, well, why do people, you had two people, one gets cancer, the other one, why didn't the other person get the cancer? We always look at a factor or a risk for the person who does get it. We don't ever look at why people aren't getting it.
Well, can I tell you mathematically it's the same? You just flip it around. It doesn't make any difference. So if I say that being physically inactive doubles your risk of bowel cancer, that's the same as saying being physically active halves your risk of getting bowel cancer. So, or to say that you are, not getting bowel cancer, it's the same kind of thing. So I could say being physically active makes you twice as likely not to get bowel cancer. It's just mathematics. It doesn't really make any difference which way you look at it. We do it in a convenient way, but as I said, it really doesn't affect it in terms of the way it comes out.
I would suggest to you that that may not be totally the picture. It would be if you knew exactly all the factors for the whole thing. In other words, if the mathematical system was closed. But it's not. And therefore, I think this man has a very sharp point. It's exactly what was done with AIDS. They studied the disease. But what has become interesting is that subpopulation, I think, in Uganda, of prostitutes, most of whom are infected with AIDS, but the subpopulation is not. And they are apparently making some progress by focusing on that. So I'm afraid I would have to disagree with your...
Well, I stand by my answer because mathematically it's correct. But just to point out that there's a lot we don't know about cancer. And there's a lot that's known that I don't know as well. So it's fair to say that we've still got a lot to learn. And when we look at an individual person, we cannot tell why that person did or did not get cancer. I work at population level. It's very rare that you can see a smoking gun to say that that person's cancer was caused by this. For example, if you take certain skin cancers, they often have mutations that can only be caused by sun exposure. So in those ones, we can say that sun exposure caused those skin cancers. But it's even for someone who's smoked, it's very rare that you can find a signature mutation that's due to smoking. You can, but to be able to identify causes in a particular individual is really, really difficult. And that's not really what epidemiology, which is what Diana and I do, is all about.
Any lifestyle factors for lymphoma?
Would you repeat the question?
Any lifestyle factors for lymphoma? Smoking. Lymphoma is one of those incredibly complex diseases because there's what's called non-Hodgkin lymphoma and then there's Hodgkin lymphoma as well, and they're all different. Smoking is a risk factor for non-Hodgkin lymphoma, not all kinds, but for most. It's probably the best established. There are some others. There's some chemical exposures there that might be important. But thinking specifically of lifestyle ones, I can't really think of too many. Once you get beyond the 5 sort of top cancers, our knowledge about the other ones really diminishes. Quite dramatically, actually.
We seem to be quite a heavily medicated society. Like you go to the doctor and it's always give the prescription instead of looking at the lifestyle, although I think that is changing. Are there any studies with the effect of long use of medication on the body, like a huge increase in antidepressants and high blood pressure medication? Are there any studies looking at the effect of medicine on bodies in terms of cancer factors?
Yes, there are. It's not an area in which I'm expert,
I just wanted to
but for example, I talked about hormone replacement therapy. That's one of those. For a while, people thought that statins, which are used to reduce reduce cholesterol, were related to cancer, and there have been some studies that have come out shown that not to be the case. I'm not aware of any hypertensive medications that increase the risk of cancer. Are you?
No, and I think that the thing with antihypertensive medications in particular is they do reduce your risk of stroke and other major causes of death. So, you know, even if they did slightly increase your chances of cancer, probably overall they'd be reducing your risk of dying, which is...
And and again, I'm not aware of any research on antidepressants, but Diana's argument around antidepressants is also very strong because obviously the risk of serious self-harm is very high for people with clinical depression.
Sorry, talking over. Some people are misdiagnosed and given antidepressants when that is not what they necessarily need. So, I just wondered about studies looked at antidepressants.
I don't actually know of any that have specifically looked at antidepressants. You'd have to look at them over many, many years. So they've been being used much more, now, and it's really going to be in 10 or 20 years that if a pattern, there's always a very long lead time between an exposure like that and when you might see, an outcome like cancer. I think we have one more question, and then we'll call it a night, if there is one.
Just wondering about the dosage size for vitamin D when this is prescribed. Some of the prescription amounts are sort of quite high, say fortnightly, whereas one's available commercially for daily and much smaller. I think I heard some argument that large doses of vitamin D were not considered a good idea. But this is only peripheral to your talk, but you did mention vitamin D.
I did, and it's a good point. There's one study from Victoria. In fact, my statistician was the one who analysed the data that where they used a very high dose, and I can't remember the exact dose. I think it might have been something like 100,000 international units. I shouldn't have said that because I'm not 100% sure what it was, but it had fractures and falls as its outcome. And what it showed was that at these very high doses, it actually increased the risk of fracture. So that's the only study that's been shown that's shown to do that, and that caused an incredible furor in the sort of osteoporosis societies around the world. Other people have been trying to replicate that, but in our trial, for example, we're using a monthly dose of about 50,000 international units. The ones that you can buy across the counter often have 1,000 international units in them, 25. Yeah, so those are lower. So in fact, we're getting our vitamin D from New Zealand because there's a company here that provides it and packages it for us at the kind of dose that we want. So we did a lot of work to make sure that the dose that we were using was sound from a harm or risk point of view. But there is that one trial with those very high doses, and they were given once every 3 months or something. I can't remember how often it was. Yeah, and the idea was that you can give someone a shot once in a blue moon, and it will keep them protected for quite some time. But at least in that study, it didn't seem to work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming this evening. And thank you very much, Dallas, for such a wide-ranging talk. The key message that I've taken from it is that I should not spend my summers sitting outside in the sun in my bikini next to a barbecue with a steak on it, drinking Chardonnay and smoking a cigarette. I recommend you don't do that either. But maybe. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all your questions and for all the interaction. And thank you very much, Dallas, for all the effort.